Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director at the National Council on Public History, and we are a membership association dedicated to helping public historians put history to work in the world through community building, programs, and scholarship. Thank you for joining us today for the final webinar in our six-part series exploring the new scholarship related to the World War II home front, facilitated as part of the National Park Service's commissioning of an update to the 2007 theme study on the topic. As you know, we've explored topics related to disability in the home front, LGBTQ history in the home front, and today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Matt Basso and PhD candidate John Flynn on Latino history in the home front. Recordings from all of the past webinars have been posted online, and we will post this one additionally as soon as we can for all of you to have access. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. Closed captions have been enabled, and if you don't see them automatically, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please be sure to keep your microphone muted during the presentation, and at any time you can pop questions into the chat area, and I'll note them for our Q&A with Dr. Basso and John at the end of the presentation. And last, before we really get underway, I want to give a warm welcome to Dr. Emily Button-Cambick from the National Park Service for some words of welcome. Emily?
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Emily Button-Cambick. I'm the Bureau Historian and National Coordinator for the American World War II Heritage City Program. And we would like to thank Stephanie, Dr. Basso, John, and their whole research team at University of Utah, as well as Megan Hillman, Program Manager at NCPH, for this series, as well as their partnership in the larger project that it's part of. This National Historic Landmark Theme Study Update brings new scholarship on several topics related to the World War II homefront to support the work that the designated homefront heritage cities are doing in recognizing historic sites within their borders, as well as setting up more resources for the public history field in designating sites and telling underrepresented stories. And we look forward to the publication of the NHL Theme Study Update and to this webinar coming just after Latino Conservation Week. So fortunately, it doesn't end on September 22nd, but we can keep talking about Latino history and the many ways it intersects with other histories in our public lands. So thank you so much, Stephanie, Matt, and John. We're so excited to hear from this webinar.
Thank you, Emily. It's now my pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today. First, we have John Flynn, who works as the Assistant Director of the American West Center and is also a PhD candidate at the University of Utah, where he researches public lands in the American West and the intersections of environment, outdoor recreation, atomic landscapes, and indigenous history. As a public historian, John has worked on projects for the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, the National Park Service, the Department of Energy, and Brown University's Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. Dr. Matt Basso is an associate professor of history and gender studies at the University of Utah and the author of Volume 2 of the National Park Service's World War II and the American Homefront Theme Study. He is the author or editor of 4 other books, including Meet Joe Copper, Masculinity and Race in Montana's World War II Homefront, and his current monograph project uses New Zealand history to consider settler masculinity through the lens of work and war. In collaboration with his students, he's partnered on public history projects with the NPS, Forest Service, Smithsonian Institution, Utah Humanities, and the Utah Division of Indian Affairs, and other state and local organizations. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. A big shout out once again to the National Park Service and National Council for Public History for supporting this work. And that's a big team. So I can't list all of them, but I really want to kind of say thanks to the full group. I also want to thank my research team, represented here by John Flynn, my co-presenter this week. It's really been a joy to work with my University of Utah students, undergraduate and graduate, and other students from other universities in the multiple phases of this project. Stephanie's already noted that these presentations are going to be available online. I hope that folks will use them in multiple different ways, and of course, we'll also use the soon to be published theme study. That includes, I hope, in classes as well as for public history projects. And most importantly, as Dr. Cambic noted earlier, with the idea of trying to preserve some of the remarkable World War II homefront history that we have had a chance to uncover or at least more fully reveal. The opening slide that you're looking at right now simply notes the title of this presentation, The Latino History of the World War II Homefront. I am a middle-aged goateed historian sitting here in Salt Lake City, and on the slide is a really lovely photo of braceros arriving in Stockton, California in May of 1943. These and other images are also in the theme study. Okay, we want to argue alongside really a remarkable set of scholars that, and this is a pretty fundamental point, but it's absolutely worth underscoring. The World War II homefront period was hugely important to Latinos and Latino history in the United States. Some of you know, perhaps most of you, that the absence of the Latino story in Ken Burns' film, The War, about World War II, was very much panned by Latinos and others. Notably, here's one quote, Carlos Guerra at the San Antonio Express called it an outrage. Now, it's an outrage for two reasons. One is because I've already noted the importance of that story, but secondly, because there's been so much good scholarship that's been done. That scholarship, if anything, has increased since 2007. I have not taken the opportunity in these webinars to list the scholars that we're citing in very much detail. I do that in the theme study, but here I'm going to take a brief moment to really underscore the fact that we have stood on these folks' shoulders, that it's their remarkable scholarship that makes this presentation and the theme study possible. And here I'm talking about folks like Emilio Zamora, Elizabeth Escobedo, Zaragoza Vargas, Lorena Oropeza, Matt Garcia, Cynthia Orozco, Natalia Molina, Tom Guglielmo, Lilia Fernandez, Natalia Mendoza. Particular shout out to Dr. Mendoza, who's got a forthcoming book that I think is going to be amazing. And I urge folks to make sure they pick that up when it comes out. A whole set of Zoot Suit scholars, a whole set of Bracero scholars, and all the scholarship in really fine collections like those put out by Maggie Rivas Rodriguez and her collaborators. So again, really some fantastic stuff out there. And because of that, we have what is now ultimately a complex, contradictory, and contextually specific story of the home front, of the Latino home front at our fingertips. We're going to tell that story by talking first about the wartime military record and focusing in, of course, on the home front, because the home front is very much a militarized space, as I've been at pains to make that point numerous times in these presentations. That's because of military bases, that's because of the presence of military personnel, but it's also because of a change of attitude and ideology, which also very much impacts the Latino home front. After talking about the wartime military, we're then going to move from east to west. We're going to talk about Puerto Rico and then the East Coast. We're going to shift over to the Southwest and then to California. And in California, we're going to focus on two especially important stories. That's the story of Mexican and Mexican Americans and work, and the story of resistance that kind of accompanies that. That's most especially represented by the Zoot Suit riot. And then we're also going to talk about a detailed part of that work story, and that's Braceros. And we'll wrap up with a conclusion. All right. To get us started on wartime military service, I'm going to turn this over to John.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So as Matt said, I'm going to start with wartime military service. And the first thing I'll note is that for Latinos, the number of enlisted ranges from at the low end, 340,000 to at the high end, 750,000, which would represent about 5% of all US troops. And the question is, well, why this big range? And that's because racial classification issues and other demographic problems, because of these, it's not certain how many Latinos served in the war. And I'll touch on these issues in a second here, but first highlight that while for many Latinos, the military offered significant economic improvement, numerous Latinos and Latinas enlisted to express their patriotism. And historian Lorena Oropeza writes that, quote, by 1940, people of Mexican descent in the US were twice as likely to have been born and raised in the United States than not, and they strongly identified with the country of their birth. And for Latinas, Latina women served in both the Women's Army Corps and the women accepted for voluntary service. And here on this slide, there's a picture of some wax boarding a plane in 1944. But back to this question of this racialization and classification, this is a theme we'll see in this military service, but also on the home front. The racial classification of Latinos and Latinas was complex. Earlier in the 20th century, most had been categorized by the census as white, yet how they were perceived and treated was quite different depending on the time, place, and what other communities of color were present. In the racially segregated World War II military, most Latinos served in white units, but officials sometimes classified them as Mexican, and Puerto Rican men were often assigned to Black units and given jobs as mess workers or kitchen workers. So these Puerto Ricans who had been considered white on the island could find themselves categorized as colored on the mainland. And to that point, Afro-Cuban men were almost always classified and assigned to Black units. And Matt, if you could advance that slide. But switching to the home front where we'll start in this kind of east to west movement is the island of Puerto Rico. And here on this slide, there's a map, and you can see Puerto Rico is highlighted in green, and then there's an insert of where it would be at the larger mainland US. Puerto Rico became a US territory in 1898, and it was a critical node in the US Navy's Atlantic and Caribbean strategies. And living more than 1,000 miles from the mainland, Puerto Ricans had a unique wartime experience. It was a colonial economy that was defined by centuries of land dispossession and dominated by sugar plantations, which made Puerto Ricans reliant on food staples that were shipped in from the US and elsewhere. But once the US entered the war, Germany started to target ships bringing food and taking sugar from the island. And by early 1942, prices had skyrocketed and bare store shelves were the norm. For example, for one almost 90-day period, there was no rice available anywhere on the island. And moreover, when ships did make it to Puerto Rico, a substantial portion of the cargo was often earmarked for the military. Consequently, the German submarine blockades, coupled with the colonial economy, hit Puerto Rico particularly hard. And by 1942, unemployment hit 37%. So the US military, whose presence in Puerto Rico had begun expanding during mobilization, reshaped the economic and social relations dramatically on the island. A substantial number of Puerto Ricans helped build the new bases that dotted the landscape. For example, construction jobs associated with the massive Roosevelt Roads Naval Station paid $2.25 a day, which was double what the sugar industry had offered. In short, Puerto Ricans found their lives militarized in countless ways as the island became the linchpin for the US strategy in protecting the Caribbean. And while for some on the island, this did improve their circumstances, as many hoped that the US pledge to support anti-colonial efforts across the globe would mean greater freedom for the island. For others, like residents of Vieques, they found themselves in an even worse position under the de facto military rule, as the military seized these agricultural lands on the island that residents relied upon, ending their main source of income. So because of the impact of colonialism and militarism that it was on the economy and way of life, Some residents felt forced to leave for better pay and a better future for themselves and their families. Often they went first to New York or Florida, where they joined a large diasporic community. And that leads us into this next slide where Matt will talk about New York and Florida.
Thank you, John. So on the cusp of the war, there was already between 45,000 and 100,000 Puerto Ricans living in New York City's Colonia Hispania, the Brooklyn and Manhattan neighborhoods where most resided. The Colonia was also home to Dominicans, Mexicans, South Americans, Spanish-speaking Caribbean, Spaniards, and Cubans. Latinos, of course, resided in other places in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, but it's New York City and Florida which they became most closely associated with. The activism and well-developed support network that characterized the Puerto Rican and larger Latino community in New York City was necessary as the community faced heightened bias. The pattern was in keeping with increased violence the community had seen during the Great Depression. As Emily Brooks writes, signs stating, quote, "No dogs, no Negroes, and no Spanish," end quote, marked apartment buildings and advertised the city's racial hierarchy. The national media did little during the mobilization period and certainly during the Great Depression to challenge the circumstances that Puerto Ricans faced. Instead, they traded in racist stereotypes tied to gender norms, using phrases like lazy and dangerously dependent, and the idea that Spanish folks produced too many children and the men failed to work in properly masculine venues, while women, quote, sucked dry public relief funds. This form of racism did not stop Latinos in New York City from, during the mobilization period, especially the war, finally experiencing full employment. However, the jobs they were often able to access were not in higher paying war industries. 2/3 of working class Puerto Ricans, for example, worked in low wage jobs through the homefront period and beyond. The garment industry, which employed many Latinos, shipbuilding, these two made especially valuable contributions to the war effort, the latter being among those higher paying jobs that some could access. Unionization rates increased in parallel with these jobs, and the union movement and its relationship to Latino workers before and during World War II is a critical point of emphasis and scholarship. The movement sponsored significant drives for Puerto Rican and Black women who labored as laundry workers and hotel maids during the war. And they also helped migrants who came to Puerto Rico on the cusp of the war settle into new lives. The situation in Florida, the other major Latino center on the East Coast, complicates the New York City picture, underscoring the importance of nuance and context. Tampa, for instance, especially Ybor City, the neighborhood, was also home to a remarkable range of Latins, including Puerto Ricans and others. Race, ethnicity, and class divided this populace, but there was also strong affinities among the Spanish, Cuban, and Italian families who dominated the neighborhood in Ybor City for decades before the war. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of Ybor City's Latino community was the inclusion of Afro-Cubans, who in other parts of the city and certainly in the state faced segregation and prejudice at a much higher level. Latino groups in Tampa experienced distinctive tensions that help us see the specificity of the home front, and especially in the mobilization period. Leading up to the war, Spanish residents of the city, for example, faced scrutiny because they supported the Spanish Civil War Republicans, who were backed by the Soviet Union. Italians who had not filed for US citizenship faced pressure as enemy aliens, and the neighborhood responded to these and other threats by pledging patriotism at every turn. During the war, Tampa's Spanish, Italian, and light-skinned Cuban Latins were classified as white, a point that John referenced earlier, and had access to the privileges of whiteness, or at least most of those, including serving as officers in white units. For some, however, the war felt like a call to assimilate and leave behind their distinctive ethnic identities. Afro-Cubans, meanwhile, faced the full set of frustrations associated with being Black in wartime America, and that includes serving in segregated units, as we noted previously. Latinos who left the East Coast and Puerto Rico for better employment opportunities found a varied geography of acceptance and discrimination. I discussed the South, Oklahoma, Chicago, and in the case of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, places like Montana in the larger chapter, but I want to transition now to focusing for a moment on the Southwest. The anti-immigrant rhetoric and practices that increased during the Great Depression in the Southwest framed Latino lives in the region during mobilization and the war. Anti-immigrant sentiment targeted not only farm workers, but Mexican and Mexican American industrial workers as well. White-dominated trade unions were among those that pushed anti-immigration policies aimed at Mexicans. And on the slide is bullet points about this story, as well as a photo of Mexican American women working at the Friedrich refrigeration plant in San Antonio, Texas during World War II. The Arizona Labor Council wrote to the American Federation of Labor prior to the war, asserting that, quote, industrial, social, and educational standards of Americans in Arizona's extractive industries have been dramatically undermined by the Mexican influx. They were far from alone in expressing these sentiments, and beginning in 1929, the Department of Labor under Hoover, something carried forward by Roosevelt, enacted an immigration restriction campaign, as many folks know. We speak more about that in the chapter. Racist beliefs were the backbone of the inequality of opportunity, faced by Latinos in the Southwest and across the nation. A Gallup poll at the beginning of the war helps us see this. Americans polled still ranked Latin races, including Mexicans, near the bottom of those they admired. They placed English, Scandinavians, and other whites as top. Mexicans and Mexican Americans responded in different ways. Many turned to labor activism. Others followed a political strategy built on federal government's desire for good relations with Latin America, relying on the Americanization of Latinos and legislative and legal initiatives. A third group, though, resisted assimilation, arguing that it made little sense to join a racist society. We want to speak about all three of these cases. Mexicans and Mexican Americans, who comprised more than 50% of the Southwest's copper mining and smelting workforce, provide one of the best examples of using the mobilization era and wartime labor organizing for economic and social change. The International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers' interracial and cross-border strategy, which was opposed by many conservatives who called the union communist, played a significant role in this effort. Others in the government did not want this activism for fear of hurting the US's good neighbor efforts. More on those in a few moments. But workers kept on organizing, and they turned to the FEPC with, frankly, limited success. That's the Federal Employment Commission. One other group is worth highlighting here. And again, the larger chapter speaks much more about all of these groups, and that's New Mexico's Hispano population. This is a term preferred by Mexican and Spanish descended people in this state. The war was a perfect opportunity, leaders in this community argued, to make up for the state's underdevelopment, which was the fault of the federal government, and to help Hispanos enter the modern economy. As George I. Sanchez put it, the government needed to undertake, quote, a comprehensive program of economic reconstruction and rehabilitation, end quote, along the same lines they had done with Native Americans. We speak more about that and the dramatic limits of its success in our Native American and Indigenous chapter. Hispanos believed that the prejudice they faced in New Mexico was less than that faced by Mexicans and Mexican Americans in other parts of the Southwest. However, they noted they saw the war as potentially shifting this dynamic as new people came into the state who were not familiar with its racial norms. Congressman Dennis Chavez was an interesting player in this story, often forefronting the patriotic or the patriotism of these American citizens in New Mexico. Leaders were not wrong about this patriotic mindset of many Mexican Americans and Latinos in the Southwest, but again, they faced significant racism. We talk more about that patriotism, but we do want to note that many folks in New Mexico, in an effort to try to improve the situation for their families, would leave for the booming war cities, especially those in California, during mobilization and into the heart of World War II. John's going to discuss political organizing and assimilation, and I'm going to talk some about that too. John especially is going to talk about the Good Neighbor policy and LULAC. The third approach we will speak to in just one moment, and that's the approach of rejecting assimilation, which is represented by Zoot Suiters especially. John, it's all yours.
Thanks. So one key element for this fight for equal treatment and activism was how Latinos on the home front used U.S. foreign policy to shape, or how U.S. foreign policy shaped domestic challenges, and how these Latino activists leveraged this to better circumstances for their communities. In particular, like Matt alluded to, this would be Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy, which sought to strengthen relations with Latin America by showing improvements in how it treated U.S. Latinos. The war made Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy even more important, especially to fight Axis influence in Latin America. And this in turn meant that the federal government had to look inward to keep good relations with Latinos living in the US. So Latino activists, such as those in the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, and I have that listed on one of the bullet points on the slide, leveraged this foreign strategy to change domestic policy to better the lives of Latinos living in the US. So politically oriented Mexican-American leaders, especially academics and professionals in Texas, New Mexico, and California, formed another wing in the campaign to improve the situation for Latinos in the Southwest. Seeking to use the government's desire to strengthen Latin American alliances, they wrote to political leaders and agencies like the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, OCIAA, another acronym that's listed on this slide. This organization was established in 1940 to execute the Good Neighbor policy, and LULAC leaders requested that a federal program was issued to address the problems that their communities faced. For example, George Sanchez, who is president of LULAC, bolstered this message by personally lobbying Nelson Rockefeller, who was the coordinator of OCIAA, and also Vice President Henry Wallace. Sanchez reminded officials that there were more than 5 million Latinos living in the US, and nearly 3 million of these Latinos were Mexican-descended residents in the Southwest. He described them as a, quote, orphan people who had been marginalized by a dominant society to such an extent that they lived in a, quote, veritable concentration camp. Related to this, the Office of War Information, commonly OWI, had designated the Americans All campaign to compel white Americans with Northern and Western European immigrant backgrounds to more fully accept those from other parts of Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Latino activists, in coordination with the OCIAA, led the campaign aimed at Latin America, represented by the Spanish phrase, Americanos todos. And here on the slide is a poster for Americanos todos and Americans all, and it says in both English and Spanish, Americans all, let's fight for victory. Sanchez and other Mexican-American leaders asked the government to support state anti-discrimination legislation that would improve the experience of their community during the war. However, as we will see, most notably in the case in California and the Zoot Suit riots, racial discrimination and even racial violence continued throughout the home front, even though it threatened the US's foreign policy and diplomatic relations with Latin America. Matt, you can advance the slide. Oh, you're muted, Matt.
Sorry about that, everyone. Folks can also blame my technical prowess for John's slides not actually reflecting what he thought they reflected. This is my slide deck instead of his, but the chapter speaks about LULAC and the other federal organizations that he mentioned at greater length. We want to shift to wartime Los Angeles, as John just noted, and as he again noted, the Americans' all federal intervention was a big part of the wartime story, especially in Los Angeles, as was, of course, the movement of a significant population of Latinos into the city where there already was a significant population. As the history of agricultural labor, which I cover much more fully in the theme study, shows, before the war, the lack of job mobility that defined the experience of those workers of Mexican descent in California and other parts of the Southwest, that continued. Job mobility was not a given with the beginning of either mobilization or the war itself. Significant changes did begin in California in 1942, especially in aircraft manufacturing. But by and large, the pre-war pattern continued into 1943. In October 1942, War Manpower Commission official Guy Nunn confirmed this assessment in comments about limited employment opportunities open to Mexican and Mexican Americans in Southern California's war industries. His research found that they were, quote, still confined to unskilled or semi-skilled employment characterized by a high degree of seasonality, end quote. Nunn added that those who gained a toehold in war work would almost certainly be assigned the lowest skilled and paid positions. By 1944, Mexicans and Mexican Americans comprised 10 to 15% of the workforce at two Los Angeles Lockheed factories. Remarkably, 80% of those workers were women. The number at Douglas Aircraft were equally impressive, with 12,000 Mexican descent workers. Workers were driven by dramatically improved wages, better working conditions, patriotism, and the freedoms war production work afforded them, especially women, as Elizabeth Escobedo has outlined marvelously in her research. Younger Mexicans and Mexican Americans reacted to the circumscribed possibilities afforded them and their parents differently than their elders. Census data from 1940 indicates there were approximately twice as many American-born Mexican Americans, often children or young adults, as Mexican-born individuals in the US. During the war, Mexican American youth saw themselves as caught between two cultures. At the center of these tensions were Pachuco gangs, popular among second-generation young people. Also called cholos, Pachucos wore baggy zoot suits. Zoot suiters felt like they and their families were treated like enemies before the war, and that continued into the wartime period. Mobilization in the early war period, marked by limited educational opportunities, housing discrimination, employment bias, and robust policing, made matters worse. Middle-class reformers and others urged them to assimilate in the mainstream white society, even as that society continued to treat them inequitably. Each passing month saw increased demands for patriotism. Zoot suiters and those that were in their circle responded by more fully committing to creating autonomous cultural spaces that used fashion, art, dance, and music as vehicles of resistance and protests. How authorities responded to the Sleepy Lagoon case dramatically escalated matters in Los Angeles. Some of you know this story. The controversy begins in August 2nd, 1942, after a murder of a young Mexican-American man. The police do neighborhood sweeps, detaining hundreds of Mexican-American young men, especially Pachucos. They also detain Pachucas, young Mexican-American women. 22 of the men are arrested and put on trial for murder. Historians have shown that the LAPD fabricated the idea of a crime wave that they associated with zoot suiters. Another result of Sleepy Lagoon was bringing young Mexican-American women into the spotlight. Again, this story is really told wonderfully by Escobedo. After the Sleepy Lagoon murder, a multiracial coalition of individuals whose communities also faced systematic discrimination and their white allies formed a support network for themselves and for the young Mexican Americans who had been charged. More on this activism and networking in the conclusion. John.
So in the aftermath of Sleepy Lagoon, racial tensions in LA continued to rise and reached over the next year and reached a boiling point in June of 1943. After an altercation one night between Zoot Suiters and some US Navy men who were returning to the Naval Armory in northern Los Angeles, around 50 US sailors retaliated by storming the Latino neighborhood around Alpine Street, which is kind of north of the city, rushing into restaurants and theaters and beating anyone who was wearing a zoot suit and stripping them of their clothing. And the violence didn't end on that night, and instead the attack on Alpine Street kicked off a more than week-long violent rampage that moved through the city as US sailors and servicemen from around LA and Southern California continued to move through the city, going into stores, restaurants, and theaters and attacking Zoot Suiters. And while this is called the Zoot Suit riots, and initially the servicemen were attacking anyone wearing a zoot suit, the riots expanded beyond that, where the attacks would be on anyone from the Latino community, and then subsequently anyone from the African American community as well. And the Zoot Suit riots revealed the ways that white supremacy was embedded into dominant society and the US military. During the riots, the shore patrol and military superiors allowed servicemen to rampage through the city. And crucially, the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, also became complicit. For example, when rioting sailors stormed through LA's Broadway theater district and went into the Orpheum Theater, which is pictured on the top picture of my slide here, they went in and started to attack anyone wearing a zoot suit. For one Mexican American in particular, Vicente Morales, who was dragged outside, beaten, and stripped of his clothes. When the LAPD arrived on the scene, it was Morales who was arrested for, quote, disturbing the peace, while the rioting servicemen were allowed to continue or go free. And here on the bottom picture, you can see the aftermath of two Mexican Americans who were beaten and stripped of their clothing on the Broadway street in the theater district of LA. But the riots also galvanized the solidarity between different communities in LA. When the US servicemen started to push into the predominantly African American neighborhood around 12th and Central in Los Angeles, both members of both the African American neighborhood and Latino communities banded together to actually fight back against the attacking police and servicemen. And so the Zoot Suit riots carried heavy implications for civil rights during and after the war. As historian Luis Alvarez notes, Zoot Suiters, quote, did not simply suffer beatings from white policemen and servicemen as hapless victims, but actively challenged the wartime consensus by initiating physical confrontations with white servicemen and contesting the meaning of American democracy in the home front, end quote. So this racial violence created an interracial alliance to combat this white supremacy, which began on the streets and carried forward after the riots. These Zoot Suit riots catalyzed the alliances that had begun to form following the Sleepy Lagoon trial that Matt was alluding to, and influenced Latino politics and culture for decades to come. And Zoot Suits, which had become both a protest of the war and a reminder of racial violence, emerged as the primary symbol for the ensuing Chicano movement. And Matt, if you could advance the slide. And the last topic I'll touch on here is the Braceros program. And there's typically a lot of focus on this during the early Cold War period. And I'll note that up until it ended in 1964, over 4 million workers came into the U.S. Temporary workers came into the U.S. But the Braceros emerged as a program during the World War II home front. And in 1942, when labor shortages hit the U.S. agricultural sectors particularly hard, the government responded with the Emergency Labor Program, aka what's commonly more known as the Braceros program. And during the war, 200,000 people came into work as agricultural workers, mostly in the Southwest and in California, but 130,000 came to work in extractive industries and in the railroad, traveling even as far away as Rhode Island. I'm sorry, I meant 200,000, 200K. However, racism in the United States also limited the aid that bracero workers could provide. For example, in Iowa, it wasn't until 1944 that farmers turned to braceros for help to save the harvest. And moreover, employers in Arkansas and other parts of the South used braceros as a reserve labor force to keep Black and Native American workers in check. This was also a fear for white workers as well, as white industrial workers believed their employers would use braceros to undercut their wages and working conditions. As braceros themselves faced intense inequities or unfair treatment, a big thing to highlight here is the way that braceros took agency into their own hands and fought for better treatment. For these workers, the lack of government inspectors and the inability to turn to a nearby Mexican consulate and the distance from supportive communities meant they often had to go alone as they sought to address these inequities. But braceros launched a de facto campaign of resistance, including frequent strikes, slowdowns, and high desertion rates. And because of this, historian Mario Cifuentes found that braceros, quote, received better wages and had better food and housing, in part because they took a more militant stance toward their employers and went on strike more often, end quote. And that'll bring us to our next slide here, Matt.
Thank you very much, John. Was that what you wanted to cover for braceros, John?
Yeah.
Great. So we're going to transition into the conclusion of our presentation. Just as the government facilitated braceros into the U.S. economy, which for some Latino workers was potentially a threat to their own economic well-being, Mexican American workers and other Latino workers wanted the government to also come to their aid. We've already noted this to a certain degree in allusion to their entry into war work in Los Angeles, but I want to also note that striking farm workers in Southern California and other places urged the government to come to their aid, which often did not happen. But for workers in war production, they sought the intercession specifically of the FEPC. In California, efforts to gain FEPC assistance for Mexican Americans seeking war industry work were dwarfed, however, by efforts to right the wrongs that Black laborers faced. 1/5 of the cases the FEPC heard in California dealt with Latinos. In contrast, in Texas, Louisiana, and New Mexico, approximately 37% of the cases were related to Latinos. Nonetheless, activism occurred on multiple fronts. The Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee's legal and coalition building approach offers some additional insights into the strategies that Mexican Americans and their allies used to combat prejudice during the second half of the war. The coalition led a long campaign to show that the convictions were representative of Nazi ideals about race as biological. The racial liberalism that came to define government and much public discourse on the home front had at its core a new understanding of race as cultural. Suggesting racism had much to do with the convictions of these folks in the Sleepy Lagoon case proved a smart tactic. The appeal the committee filed on their behalf succeeded in October of 1944. In subsequent decades, Mexican Americans would rehabilitate the reputation of wartime pachucos, as John alluded to. These became figures that were seen as critical in the history of resistance against white supremacy. In contrast, however, pachucas, who played a significant part in wartime LA Zoot Suit culture, remained marginalized through the 1960s and 70s. The experience of Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez and their children illustrates the development of interracial alliances and the complexity of the Latino experience on the World War II home front, as well as how much that experience reflected the relational calculus that helped determine identity and power on the home front. The photo that you see here is of the Mendezes. Gonzalo Mendez arrived in the US a few decades before World War II, when the demand for Mexican immigrant labor was high, on Southwest farms. Felicitas Mendez and her family came from Puerto Rico and were also recruited to pick cotton in Arizona. The Mendezes, during the war, leased a farm in Westminster, California, because the US government had incarcerated the Japanese American family who owned the property. Braceros did some of the labor required to make the farm successful during the war. Although the census classified them as white, in Orange County, where Westminster was located, over 80% of Mexican American children went to segregated schools for students of color. Instruction was based on the presumption that Mexican descent children would be agricultural workers and therefore not need anything other than vocational skills. The Mendez children were among these segregated students. They fought back with LULAC and then also the JACL and NAACP filing supporting briefs. They filed a federal court case. This court case, as many of you know, eventually succeeded. In 1946, the decision, which was upheld on appeal in 1947, an appeal, by the way, that saw Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP already mentioned file supporting briefs with arguments that were similar to those he would use in Brown versus Board of Education. This upholding, the white judge ruled that receiving a segregated education damaged Mexican American children pedagogically, psychologically, and socially. The Westminster ruling supports, the Mendez ruling supports the optimistic view of what the war meant for Latinos. One person who offered that view in 1947 was the activist Carrie McWilliams in his book, North from Mexico. Historian David Gutierrez's view from decades after the war, though, offers a less sanguine and more nuanced assessment. During and immediately after the war, Mexican American activists and their allies, like those involved in the case, undertook, quote, a spirited and persistent struggle for civil rights based on the promise of equality at the symbolic center of the American war effort, Gutierrez writes. Yet he adds, quote, thousands more Mexican Americans and Latinos remain deeply ambivalent about their cultural identity and citizenship as Americans. The war was also central to this view. It was defined by the failure of dominant society to acknowledge the long history of anti-Mexican racism and anti-Latino racism, and by demands for ultra-patriotism and conformity on the part of Latinos and an amplification of xenophobia. But it was also defined by resistance and a continuing fight into the Cold War, a fight that World War II and the home front were the absolute bedrock of. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matt and John. That was a fantastic presentation, and we already have some questions coming in the chat. So if you don't mind, I'll send those your way.
Right.
The first we have is from Susan Ferentinos, who asks if the study team find any of this history has been preserved in the built environment through historic designation or historic markers.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Unfortunately, the answer isn't great. Not much has been preserved, though importantly, very importantly, based off of the work of the Latino theme study team, in significant part, one of the Bracero reception centers was designated a National Historic Landmark recently. Other sites in other places, there's just been less success to date, but there are important sites that really local communities should consider preserving. We're continuing the research team to work on some of those sites.
And Sarah Lee writes and asks, I have read oral histories of former braceros talking about them being required or pressured to donate blood frequently for wounded soldiers to prove their patriotism. One man in particular talked about how this practice ruined his health because of how often he had to donate blood. Do you know of any similar pressures for Mexicans and Mexican Americans to prove their patriotism? And this participant also wanted to just comment that the dire agricultural situation of the US during the war was partially created when the Japanese were imprisoned in camps, many of whom were farmers, and that the braceros were needed to fill those vacant farm roles.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, and also for the comment. I'll note in the chat, Astrid has very kindly put the link to the Bracero NHL. I don't know that story. That's really quite interesting, but I know where to look. Interestingly enough, the historian Tom Guglielmo, whose really excellent book on the World War II home front and race relations, I commend to everyone here. The book is called Divisions, has written both in the Journal of American History and also in that book about blood politics during the home front. These are primarily around African American communities, but I suspect he mentions the status and situation for braceros. Can't say for 100%. That's quite remarkable. That's an amazing story. Some of you will know that braceros and their bodily autonomy was another part of the home front story, specifically the spraying of them with pesticides and chemicals as they came across the border. A not good situation, but yet another part of the complex story of Latinos on the home front.
Thank you. And I'll point out that Emily also put into the chat the Blackwell School related to the subject of the Mendez case is one of the newest National Historic Sites associated with segregated education for Mexican and Mexican American students in Texas. So that link is in there as well. I have my own question while we wait for other folks to add any last ones into the chat, which is what I know anytime you do a project or a presentation like this, you can never dig into everything as much as you want to be able to. So what are the areas of research on Latinos on the World War II homefront experience did you not get to explore adequately that you're hoping future scholars will pick up and move forward?
Thanks for that question, Stephanie. I really do appreciate it. The first that comes to mind is folks could tell from our presentation that we focused on California in particular, on Puerto Rico, some on New York, some on Tampa, and a little bit on Texas. There's great scholarship about Texas. I would have liked to bring even more of that into the theme study. And the good news is that there's other scholars who have published in this area. I suspect there are really important sites around Texas, as well as, of course, the Southwest and into California that we need to preserve and work on. Another region that's had really strong scholarship over the last 20 years that we touch on in the theme study, but not to the depth I would have liked to, is Chicago. Lots of folks here will know that the scholarship on Latinos in Chicago is robust, and their presence is an important part of the social fabric of that city and an important part of the larger and complex Latino story, especially the creation of almost a pan-Latino identity, particularly around Puerto Rican and Mexican American communities. So I would have liked to have done more with that as well. The bracero stories and other agricultural workers, not just braceros, as they move throughout the West, is yet another story that I think we could have done a little bit more with. We touch on it thanks to really great scholarship about the Pacific Northwest, but each of these places has, I think, even deeper stories that we could tell, including some really important strikes that John alluded to and that we do talk about in the theme study.
Thank you. Astrid Liverman also put in the chat an encouragement to check out the work of Rio Vista's stewards, including the Historic Preservation Officer, Victor Retta, and the partnership of Sahia Mota Casper, Latinos and Heritage Conservation. And there is a link in the chat there as well. So if folks want to be able to save these links and explore later, if you look at your chat window and you click the three dots in the top right corner of the chat window, you have the option to save that. And please do explore those fantastic resources. Travis Raderman asks, any specific knowledge on braceros in Arkansas? I've run across articles in newspapers while researching German and Italian POW farm labor, but never dove into it any further.
Thank you for that question, Travis. I don't know a ton more than you do, but I am with you. We say a little bit more about a farm in Missouri, but we do talk about the POW situation in Arkansas and just the triangulation by white farmers to get the lowest cost labor they possibly can. John alluded to that already in regard to both Black workers and Native American workers. But the use of POWs and the use of Japanese American incarcerees, all of that is part of this kind of complicated agricultural World War II home front story that's super important. And in some ways is dominated by kind of white volunteers, housewives, school kids, that sort of thing. But really, this was a large effort to use what is often unfree labor to, or what we would today define as unfree labor, to bring in those crops. So I hope folks will consider doing more on that, because you're exactly right. It's a key topic.
Thank you. Astrid also put a link in the chat to the LULAC Clubhouse property that folks might want to explore through the National Trust for Historic Preservation. As we near the top of the hour, I want to give you, John, a chance to add anything that you wish you had more time to either talk about today or look into. And Matt, if you have any reflections as this series comes to an end and you turn back to the final preparations to release volume 2 of this theme study.
Yeah, I think Matt alluded to it. I worked on the Texas essay, and I'm from Texas, so there's a lot of stuff I already knew and a lot of stuff I already learned working on that. And I think that is an area where there could be a lot more that we didn't get a chance to go into. And then working on the Zoot Suit riots, the National Historic Landmark recommendations was really great. And I could talk about that all day, because I think that's they're interesting ways to use the built environment to explore that story, which would be really cool.
Yeah, I want to note a couple of things. First, I've really been thrilled by the community that has developed both around these webinars, but in this larger effort that the National Park Service has spearheaded to bring World War II home front histories back to the fore, back into much more national prominence, whether it's the Heritage Cities program or other things. It's just been super exciting to learn from folks. I will note, as really a nice representation of this, Sarah Lee has pointed out that she's got a podcast in the comments about agriculture on the home front, Victory Kitchen, which just sounds fantastic, right? There's just so much good work being done right now. I'd urge folks to do a deep Google of National Park Service website pages in particular, because there's just some great ones. We've referenced a fair number of them in the larger theme study, but there's, again, just a bunch of historians working in the 5 areas that we focused on. That's my final point. The 5 areas which I was thrilled to focus on do not really fully represent the very cool scholarship that has taken place over the last 20 or so years since the last theme study. there's really been excellent new work on the Black experience, on the home front, on labor and histories of capitalism, on incarceration, though less, we need more on that. And of course, on gender and women's history. There's just great stuff out there. So for folks that are interested in potentially nominating sites, I urge you to dig into that. Feel free to email me, and I will pass on questions to other people that are smarter than me on certain topics. But we're really eager to facilitate what has already started, which is a renewal of attention about home front histories and the way they tie both to the histories that came before and the histories that came after, especially for diverse populations that have often found themselves marginalized in our national story. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much again, Matt and John, for this great, fantastic presentation, the great conversation we had. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, and on and off over the last 6 weeks. It's been a joy to delve into these topics, and we will keep in touch when this last recording is posted, and of course, when the theme study volume 2 is out and ready for exploration. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.